Welcome to Learning DSLR Back to Basics. My name is Phil Dame. In this episode, episode 7, I'm going to talk about 3 critical topics related to light. We'll review the properties of light, we'll talk about hard versus soft light, and how light falls off or diminishes over distance. Light, of course, is a critical part of photography. Photography, the word is actually drawing with light. So I'm going to spend an entire episode here talking more about light. Certain things about light are more obvious, such as the strength of a light, the intensity of it. I've covered off color, temperature in a previous episode. And of course, the direction of light affects how it appears in a photograph. But there is another element, another property of light that is generally referred to as the quality of light. And that boils down to 2 factors. When you have a light source in front of a subject and you wonder, well, how does one affect the quality of light? There's 2 main things. One is the size of the light, and this is something that's relative to the subject. So a very large light source relative to a person might be something that is the size of their head and chest, say a 2 foot by 2 foot light source. That would be considered a large light source versus a smaller light source like the flash on the top of your camera. Another important quality of light, or something that affects the quality of light, is the distance of the light relative to the subject. And this isn't the intensity, although that obviously comes into play, but these 2 together help shape the quality of the light so that it can be either hard or soft, which I'll describe next. When you're talking about a light and its size, it's important to factor in modifiers. Just like the lamp you have in your home that has a lampshade, it's used to diffuse the light, and it kind of changes the shape of the light and thus changes the size of the light. And in photography, it's important to note that modifiers that aren't necessarily like a lampshade sitting on the light, but are between the light source and the subject, is all the subject sees. And so it becomes the light source. And thus its size and how well illuminated it is becomes a factor when you're thinking about the size of a light source. And this is probably best illustrated by an example. The sun, of course, is a very large light source, but it's very, very, very far away. So for all intents and purposes, the light is like a dot in the sky, and all light coming from it is parallel and is thus very hard. And you know this intuitively. When you look at your shadow on the sidewalk on a summer day, it's a very crisp outline. And if you look at someone's face, the difference between the lit side and the shadow side is dramatic. If, however, it's a cloudy day, then the cloud kind of acts as a modifier. Sunlight enters it and bounces all around, and then hits the street and is bouncing all over the place, and you end up with very soft light and very hard to discern any shadows perhaps, or if there are shadows, it's very subtle, and it's very gradient from the darkest to the lightest areas, and so on. So that is what it is, soft light. So you think of those 2 examples, you'll probably never certainly get them mixed up. So hard light, as I've talked about, it gives you very crisp shadows, and it's extremely high contrast, which does have its uses. It accentuates texture on any given object, but also in a portrait. And it can add a lot of dimension because it shows depth. It's not flat at all. You can see the ridges and the shadows. Soft light, on the other hand, is usually very soft shadows and sometimes no shadow at all. You can use soft light to add light to an area that's more shadowy to make it less shadowy. It doesn't add any additional shadows. It's very low in contrast, somewhat flat, and thus it hides all the textures. So that's great for, of course, hiding imperfections in skin and what have you. And thus it's great and obviously a common aspect of portraiture for women. So just to recap, hard light, in terms of how you get it, it comes from a relatively small source of light and also a distant source of light, whereas soft light can only be generated from a light source that's relatively large to the subject you're photographing, and often it's very up close, because certainly something that is close is going to be relatively larger, just like that sun example. So I said a large light source might be a 2 foot by 2 foot light source next to someone, but if that's 10 or 20 feet away, that's still going to be considered relatively small. But if it's up close, light is going to be hitting that person's face from all directions and simulating that cloudy day and giving some really pleasing lighting that removes a lot of wrinkles and softens skin and so on. So some examples of hard light, as we talked about, direct sunlight, direct on-camera flash. Your flash head is not a very large light source, and that same flash or other light source put off camera, of course, is still a very small light source. Even though you're adding some nice direction, which is going to add dimension, it's still a small light source, and you're going to get hard, harsh shadows and a lot of texture, which you may want. Soft light, on the other hand, sources are like the cloudy day. And if you think about just your flash that you have on your camera, being able to, instead of flashing the person directly, bouncing it off a large surface like a ceiling or wall is going to create a massively large light source. Now you have a 6 or 10 foot area of wall or ceiling illuminated. You're going to have the effect of that nice soft cloudy day feel of diffused shadows rather than, say, for example, really hard shadow behind someone on a wall. And if you're starting to do some off-camera flash, of course, taking that flash and putting it to the side and then adding some sort of diffusion or some sort of modifier that makes the small flash seem larger, such as bouncing off of an umbrella surface, these photographic umbrellas, or through what's called a softbox, which takes the light and then kind of allows it to be evenly lit, a white screen, for example, that it can be 2 to 3 feet in size, is going to create that larger surface, relatively larger surface to the subject, and thus create soft light. Now, the next most important aspect is to understand how light falls off over distance. This is not intuitive. I'm going to show you a lot of numbers, and it might seem very mathematical, but I think once you get the principle of this, you'll know how to apply it. If you think of someone being about a foot away from a light source, and you say that based on what I had wanted to achieve, this person is receiving 100% of the light. They are well lit. But then I add someone, say, behind them, who's just 1 more foot away. So it's only 1 more foot, but they're twice as far from the light relative to the first person, and the first person's well lit. You might think, well, that person's probably getting half as much light. Maybe. I don't know. It depends on how the light actually falls off. And it turns out you'd be wrong. Light, when it falls off or decreases over distance, is not linear. And what I mean by that is that it's actually exponential. If you think about light leaving a small point, it's actually not going in a straight line. It's illuminating like a sphere or a globe around it. And so as it has to illuminate that surface of the globe, picture a sphere around the light growing larger, the surface area is getting exponentially larger. So that 1 point of light, 1 foot away, if you look at it as 1 square, as soon as you get twice as far away from the light, you'll have like 4 times the surface area to illuminate. So the power of the light is actually only a quarter as strong. So coming back to our example, when you have this person only 1 more foot away in this particular scenario, you are losing 75% of the light. And it's because light fall off is inversely proportional to the square of the distance. Again, I warned you that there was going to be some math here. But what you're doing is taking a factor of distance. This is 2 times further than the light, and you're squaring that value. So 1 over 2 squared, which is a quarter. And I'll illustrate this a bit more. So if distance is d, then intensity is 1 over the distance squared. Really not that complicated. So we'll take some sample measurements, 1 to 5 feet. So let's look in the middle. 3 feet. 3 squared is 9, so 1 over 9. 5 squared is 5 times 5, which is 1/25. But here's the really interesting thing. When you look at it as a percentage, you're going to notice something quite dramatic. The fall off is progressively less and less. From that first foot to the second foot, you're losing 75% of the light's strength relative to the 1 foot position. Next foot is 14% less, then 5, and then 2. Look at those last. Between 4 and 5 feet, there's only 3% difference. So it's quite dramatic when you're close to the light source, but a lot less dramatic a fall off once a lot of the light has already fallen off. And let me just if you see this as a graph, it's going to really crystallize it. If you did it on one axis, you said, well, this is the intensity of the light on the left here. And along the bottom, we're going to talk about the distance from the light source. Obviously, it's going to start off at 100% and then fall off. But watch what happens. It falls off again progressively, much more slowly towards 0%. And if we take two more examples here, so someone who was standing at 7 feet is going to get about 3.5% of the light. Someone standing at 9 feet is getting about 1.25 of the light. That's really not a big change. 2% is nowhere near 75% change. And so this is a property of light that you can use every day in your photography. So let's take an example. Let's take this person that you want to photograph. You put them really close to the light source because maybe you're trying to do a soft light scenario. So you've turned down the power of the light because they're really close. You don't need it to be very strong. And they're getting effectively 100% of the power you want them to get. They're well lit. But right behind them, only 1 foot away, is a white background. But what's going to happen to that white background is that it's not going to register as white in your photograph. It's going to show up as gray. Why? Because the well-lit subject is it's got all the light you want, but just 1 foot further, because you've got the light source so close to the subject, the background is going to get 75% as much light. What can you do about that? The simple thing is you actually just distance your subject from the light source. You're obviously going to have to increase the light intensity so that the person still gets what you think is a good exposure of light. But you turn up that light really strong and you put that person 10 feet away, they're only going to get 1% of the light. But again, since you turn the light up strong, they're still looking good and they're still well lit. And that white background is now still only a foot behind the subject. So you've got 10 feet from the subject and 11 feet from the background. What's going to happen is the background is going to register white. And it's because the subject and the background are getting nearly identical amount of light. Look at some of the values here at the bottom. You've got the subject getting 1% of that strong light and the white background's getting 0.8%. I mean, that's nearly identical. So you'll now have a well-lit subject and a well-lit background. And this same philosophy applies to things like group shots. If you have a large group of people, they're still going to be staggered feet, multiple feet apart from the first person in the group to the back person. And certainly if you're doing any side lighting, the person on the left to the person on the right, you're going to have a lot of illumination differences. So one of the ways is to make sure that everyone is the same distance from the light, but you can also just put your light source further away. And then any differences between the person in the front row and the person in the third row diminishes, and everyone will be well lit as long as the first person in the group is well lit. I hope you found that useful. We talked about the qualities of light, the properties of light. We talked about hard versus soft light and how light falls off. If you haven't done so already, please connect with me on my blog at learningdslr.com and on the social web on Facebook and Twitter. Thanks for watching.